have to have Greenland. It's not a question of, do you think we can do without it? We can't.
The United States is openly threatening to dismantle the alliance it created, not with missiles, not with tanks, but with a demand so audacious, so unprecedented, that it has left European capitals reeling and NATO itself on life support. The demand is simple. America wants Greenland, complete and total control, and the President of the United States has made it clear he's willing to sacrifice 70 years of transatlantic unity to get it. This isn't a conspiracy theory, this isn't speculation. In January 2026, leaked text messages between President Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of Norway revealed something extraordinary.
President Trump has written to Norway's Prime Minister and essentially said to him that because you, Norway, did not give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. Let's have a look at this. Will be an extraordinary document. Historians will study this in many years to come. Dear Jonas, he says, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America. Denmark cannot, he says, Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China. And why do they have a right of ownership anyway, he says of Denmark? There are no written documents. It's only that a boat landed there and hundreds of years ago, but we had boats landing there also. I've done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the United States. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland.
Trump explicitly linked his pursuit of Greenland to a personal grievance, being denied the Nobel Peace Prize. He wrote, and I quote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." Let that sink in. The leader of the free world is tying territorial expansion to a prize he didn't.
Former Congressman Matt Gaetz threw out an interesting idea suggesting that if you were to broker a deal where nuclear inspectors go into both Israel and Iran, that you could win a Nobel Peace Prize, and they might even rename it the Trump Peace Prize. Did you hear those? What do you think of that?
Well, they should give me the Nobel Prize for Rwanda, and if you look at the Congo, or you could say Serbia, Kosovo, you could say a lot of them. You could say, the big one is India and Pakistan. I should have gotten it 4 or 5 times. I should get it for the I would think the Abraham Accords would be a good one too.
But what do you
They
think
won't
of
give
that
me a
idea?
Nobel Peace Prize because they only give it to liberals.
Would you support Iran being able to have nuclear?
But this story isn't just about ego. It's about trillions of dollars in resources, the future of Arctic dominance, and a geopolitical chess game where Greenland is the square everyone wants to control. It's about a frozen island that holds the key to submarine routes, rare earth minerals, and missile defense systems. And it's about a crisis that could shatter the longest-lasting military alliance in modern history. So why Greenland? Why now? And what happens if this goes wrong? Let me walk you through it. Greenland is the world's largest island. 80% of it is covered in ice. It has a population of just 56,000 people. For most of history, it was considered strategically irrelevant, a frozen wasteland too expensive to govern, too remote to matter. But that calculation has changed dramatically. Climate change is melting the Arctic faster than anyone predicted, and as the ice recedes, something extraordinary is being revealed underneath. Resources, vast, almost unimaginable resources. We're talking about 17.5 billion barrels of oil, over 4 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, and the largest deposits of rare earth elements outside of China. Minerals essential for everything from smartphones to fighter jets to electric vehicles. Greenland isn't just land anymore, it's a treasure chest, and the United States wants the key. But there's more to this than just money. Greenland sits at the heart of what military strategists call the Guk Gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK corridor. This is the maritime gateway through which Russian submarines must pass to reach the Atlantic Ocean. If you control Greenland, you control the gap. If you control the gap, you control access to North America. In a conflict with Russia or China, that's not just valuable, it's existential. And then there's space. Greenland is home to Pituffik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. It's one of only 2 Arctic facilities the United States has for tracking satellites and providing early missile warnings. U.S. officials have made it clear, America cannot afford to cede an inch in the Arctic, not in space, and certainly not to Beijing or Moscow, so the strategic case is obvious. But here's where it gets complicated. Greenland isn't independent. It's an autonomous territory of Denmark, a founding member of NATO and one of America's closest allies. For decades, this arrangement worked perfectly. Denmark provided governance, the US maintained its military presence, and Greenland remained quiet. But Trump doesn't see it that way anymore. He's argued publicly that Denmark is too small, too weak to protect Greenland from Russian or Chinese influence. He's questioned Copenhagen's legal right to the island, and he's made it abundantly clear he wants ownership, not partnership. This isn't the first time America has tried to buy Greenland. In 1946, President Harry Truman offered Denmark $100 million in gold. The Danes refused. The offer was never seriously revisited, until Trump brought it back in 2019. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd. Trump was so offended he canceled a state visit to Denmark. The relationship never fully recovered. But now, in 2026, Trump is no longer floating the idea. He's demanding it, and he's backed that demand with threats. So let's talk numbers. If Greenland were actually for sale, what would it cost? Analysts have tried to calculate this in a dozen different ways, and the estimates are all over the map. On the low end, some say you could use the historical analog, adjusting Truman's 1946 offer for inflation and economic growth. That gives you somewhere between $12 and $20 billion. Others have tried to calculate the economic value of Greenland's extractable resources, oil, gas, minerals that are actually viable to mine with current technology. That estimate comes in around $186 billion, but those numbers don't account for strategic value. They don't account for the fact that Greenland controls access to the Arctic. They don't account for the military bases, the radar systems, the geopolitical leverage. When you start adding those factors in, the price explodes. Some analysts have done what they call a sum of the parts valuation: $400 billion for oil, $500 billion for minerals, $200 billion for real estate and infrastructure. That gets you to $1.1 trillion. And if you use Iceland's real estate prices as a proxy and scale them up to Greenland's landmass, you land at $2.76 trillion. That's almost $3 trillion. For context, that's more than the entire GDP of France. But here's the kicker. Even if the United States somehow came up with that money, even if Denmark was willing to entertain the offer, there's one group that has the final say: the people of Greenland. And 85% of them have made their position crystal clear. They are not for sale. Greenlandic Premier Mut Burapagedi has been unequivocal. Greenland is ours. We are not for sale and will never be for sale. Under Greenland's Self-Government Act, passed in 2009, the island has the right to vote for independence, and if they do become independent, they could, in theory, choose to align with the United States instead of Denmark. But the current government has stated clearly, if there's a choice, they choose Denmark. For people in Nuuk, this isn't about minerals or NATO or missile defense. It's about whether their children will grow up Danish or American. It's about language, identity, sovereignty. It's about not being treated like a commodity in a real estate deal. And that brings us to the Nobel Prize. In early January 2026, Trump sent a text message to Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre. European leaders had been urging Trump to de-escalate his tariff threats. Trump's response was blunt and startling. He wrote, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." He went on to say that while peace would remain predominant, he was now free to think about what was good and proper for the United States, specifically the acquisition of Greenland. Now, for context, Trump had openly campaigned for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. He'd pushed hard for a ceasefire deal in Gaza, hoping it would secure him the award. But the prize was given instead to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. The White House slammed the decision as politics over peace. Trump's allies called it Trump derangement syndrome, and Trump himself clearly took it personally. Prime Minister Støre had to issue a public clarification. The Norwegian government, he explained, has no role in selecting the Nobel laureate. The prize is awarded by an independent committee. But for Trump, that distinction didn't matter. The snub became a justification, a psychological turning point. If the world wouldn't reward him for peace, he'd stop letting peace get in the way of power. And that's when the threats escalated. Because Denmark and Greenland refused to negotiate, Trump has turned to his favorite weapon: tariffs. He's threatened a 10% tariff on the United Kingdom and European Union countries if they don't cooperate on Greenland. For Denmark, this is an economic nightmare. Major Danish companies, Novo Nordisk, the maker of Ozempic, Vestas, Carlsberg, have held emergency meetings with the government. If Trump follows through, Denmark's GDP could shrink by 3%. That's a recession triggered by a single policy decision. But the European Union isn't sitting still. Brussels is preparing a €93 billion retaliatory package. They're also considering deploying what they call the bazooka, the EU's anti-coercion instrument, a mechanism designed to severely limit U.S. access to European markets if Washington uses economic blackmail. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called this unacceptable coercion. French President Emmanuel Macron has used the word blackmail, and Danish officials have made it clear if the United States tries to force this through economic warfare, Denmark will fight back with everything it has. In short, Greenland isn't being invaded with soldiers, it's being surrounded with economics, but the real danger isn't tariffs, it's what comes after. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has issued a stark warning. If the United States attempts a forcible takeover of Greenland, whether through economic pressure, military action, or political subversion, it would mean the end of NATO. Not a weakening, not a strain, the end. Think about that. NATO was founded in 1949 as a collective defense pact. Article 5 of the treaty says an attack on one member is an attack on all. For 75 years, that principle has held. NATO survived the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It has been the bedrock of European security and the foundation of the American-led international order. But if the United States attacks or annexes a territory belonging to one of its own allies, what does Article 5 even mean? How can Denmark trust that America will defend it from Russia when America is the aggressor? How can any NATO member feel secure? Trump himself has acknowledged this tension. In a recent interview with the New York Times, he was asked directly, "Would you prioritize Greenland over NATO?" His answer was chilling. He said it may be a choice. He admitted that ownership of Greenland is psychologically important to him, not strategically important, not economically important, psychologically important. And that might be the most revealing thing he's said, because this isn't just about rare earth minerals or submarine gaps or missile defense. It's about legacy. It's about being the president who expanded American territory for the first time since Alaska. It's about proving he can do what no one else could. But the cost of that legacy could be catastrophic. If NATO dissolves, Europe loses its security umbrella, Russia gains a free hand in Eastern Europe. China watches and learns that alliances are temporary, that power is all that matters. The entire post-World War II order, built on treaties, alliances, and shared defense, crumbles. And it doesn't crumble because of an external enemy, it crumbles because of internal betrayal. Some analysts have tried to downplay this. They say Trump is bluffing, that he's using Greenland as leverage for other negotiations, that he'll back down once Europe offers concessions elsewhere. Maybe. But the leaked texts, the tariff threats, the public statements, they all suggest something different. They suggest he's serious. And even if he's not, the damage is already done. Trust between Washington and Copenhagen is shattered. Other NATO members are watching nervously, wondering if they're next. The alliance is already weaker, already more fragile than it was a year ago. Now let's talk about what happens if this actually moves forward. If Trump continues down this path, there are really only three scenarios. The first scenario, diplomacy somehow prevails. Denmark and the United States find a middle ground, maybe expanded military cooperation, maybe a new lease agreement for Patuffik Space Base, maybe some kind of joint Arctic development program. Greenland remains Danish, the US gets security guarantees, everyone saves face. This is the optimistic scenario, but it requires both sides to compromise, and right now, neither side is showing any willingness to do that. Trump has made ownership non-negotiable. Denmark has made non-sale non-negotiable. There's no obvious middle ground when both positions are absolute. The second scenario, economic warfare escalates into a full-blown transatlantic trade war. Trump imposes tariffs. Europe retaliates. American exports to Europe collapse. European exports to America collapse. Both economies suffer. Stock markets tank, unemployment rises, and the political fallout is severe. In this scenario, NATO survives, but barely. The alliance becomes a shell of what it once was. Military cooperation continues on paper, but the trust, the goodwill, the sense of shared purpose, all of that evaporates. America and Europe remain formal allies, but they stop acting like friends. They stop consulting each other. They stop coordinating strategy. And that creates openings for adversaries. Russia exploits divisions in Eastern Europe. China pushes harder in the Indo-Pacific. Iran becomes more aggressive in the Middle East. The world becomes more dangerous because the West is divided. The third scenario is the worst. Trump doesn't stop at economic pressure. He escalates. Maybe it's a naval blockade around Greenland. Maybe it's funding for a Greenlandic independence movement with promises of immediate U.S. annexation. Maybe it's a direct military intervention, troops landing in Nuuk, claiming they're there to protect Greenland from foreign influence. In this scenario, NATO doesn't just weaken, it dies. Denmark invokes Article 5, demanding that other NATO members come to its defense against American aggression. And then what? Does Germany deploy forces against the United States? Does France? Does the UK? Of course not. The entire premise of NATO is collective defense against external threats, not internal conflicts between members. If America becomes the threat, the alliance has no mechanism to respond. It simply collapses. And once NATO collapses, the security architecture that has kept Europe stable for 75 years collapses with it. Poland starts building nuclear weapons because it can't trust anyone to defend it. Germany begins rearming at a scale not seen since World War II. France accelerates its push for European strategic autonomy, a military force independent of America. The Baltics beg for protection from anyone willing to offer it, and Russia, watching all of this, sees an opportunity. If NATO is gone, what's stopping Moscow from moving into Estonia, into Latvia, into Lithuania? These are NATO members now, but if NATO no longer exists, they're on their own, and they're small, and they're vulnerable. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because the logic of escalation is brutal. Once you start down this path, once you make threats you can't take back, once you damage relationships beyond repair, it becomes very hard to stop. Every step forward makes the next step easier. Every compromise rejected makes confrontation more likely, and before you know it, you've crossed lines you never intended to cross. History is full of examples. World War I didn't start because anyone wanted a global war. It started because a series of escalations, miscalculations, and rigid alliances made it impossible to de-escalate. One assassination led to an ultimatum. One ultimatum led to a mobilization. One mobilization led to a declaration of war, and within weeks the entire continent was burning. No one thought it would happen, right up until it did. That's the danger here. Not that Trump wakes up one morning and decides to invade Greenland, but that a series of smaller decisions, tariffs, sanctions, military posturing, create a dynamic that spirals beyond anyone's control. And then you're in a crisis no one wanted, no one planned for, and no one knows how to resolve. So, where does this leave us? As of early 2026, the situation remains unresolved. The U.S. Congress has introduced something called the Red, White, and Blue Land Act, a proposal to fund negotiations for Greenland's acquisition. It hasn't passed, but it's on the table. Denmark has refused all offers. Greenland has made its position clear, and Trump has made his intentions equally clear. The next few months will be critical. If Trump pushes forward with tariffs, Europe will retaliate. If Europe retaliates, trade wars escalate. If trade wars escalate, economies suffer, and if economies suffer, publics demand action. That's when miscalculations happen. That's when conflicts spiral. The irony is almost unbearable. Greenland was supposed to be a symbol of cooperation. For decades, Denmark governed it, the US protected it, and Greenlanders lived in relative peace. It was a model of how NATO could work: shared interests, mutual respect, quiet collaboration. But now it's become a symbol of division, distrust, and the limits of alliance politics. And here's the thing, this didn't have to happen. There were 100 off-ramps, 100 ways to manage this quietly, diplomatically, without public threats or leaked text messages or tariff wars. But those off-ramps require restraint. They require recognizing that some things are more important than winning. They require understanding that alliances aren't just transactional. They're built on trust, on shared values, on the belief that your partners will stand with you when things get hard. And once you shatter that trust, it's almost impossible to rebuild. You can sign new treaties. You can issue joint statements. You can hold summits and shake hands and smile for the cameras. But the trust, the deep intuitive belief that your ally has your back, that's gone. And without it, the alliance is just words on paper. If NATO can't survive a dispute over Greenland, then it was never an alliance. It was a convenience. And conveniences don't last. Before we close, one quick clarification. Everything in this video is based on public information, historical context, and my own analysis. It's not a call to action, not an instruction, and not a claim about anyone's intentions. It's simply one perspective on a fast-changing situation. Reasonable people can see the same facts and reach different conclusions, and that's healthy. No matter where you stand, the goal should always be the same: stability, accountability, and peace, without fear or hate. You're welcome to share your own perspective in the comments, respectfully and thoughtfully. Thank you for watching and for thinking critically. Subscribe for more calm, fact-driven deep dives.